A billionaire tries to find his missing daughter, but when they meet again, she betrays him, only to accidentally discover the horrifying truth. Rain pounded against the glass, each drop cutting through the silence like a distant warning. Thunder rumbled in the distance, shuddering through the steel and glass frames of Richard Alvarez's apartment. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil churning inside him. His office was clean. Dark wood, clean lines, the glow of city lights creating shifting patterns on the walls. The shuffling of files filled the large space. The mansion was quiet. Richard barely noticed. His eyes were still glued to the computer screen, his fingers on the keyboard, but his thoughts were broken. Emily should have been home by now. A slow breath escaped his lips. He checked the time again, 10:47 p.m. His jaw clenched. His daughter had never been out this late without notice. Emily was responsible. She had rules. He held the phone, his body tensing as he pressed the call button. A third time, the line rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Voicemail. Richard carefully put the phone down, but his chest was still tight. He wasn't the type to panic. He had built empires, defeated enemies, directed the operations of entire industries. Control was his currency. But this, he flipped to the security system screen. A red dot. A location he didn't recognize. Richard's eyes narrowed as the address flashed at him. 13th Street. His fingers tapped the table, a quiet rhythm of agitation. Emily had no reason to be there. No friends, no school events, nothing. His mind sifted through the possibilities. Lost phone? Bad GPS signal? Something else entirely. The rain was getting heavier, pelting the windows. The city beyond stretched out endlessly, the horizon sharp and unforgiving. He pressed the call button again, this time gripping the phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Still nothing. He realized something was wrong. The last location of Emily's phone had been in an area that was not her usual route home. His fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up a street feed from the city's traffic cameras. The video flickered, then stopped in a blur. A group of men huddled under an awning, their faces obscured by the evening rain. A lone car parked at the curb, but no sign of Emily. Richard clenched his whiskey glass, his knuckles turning white. "Emily, where are you?" The phone buzzed. A single text message appeared on the screen. "If you ever want to see your daughter again, come to 13th Street alone at midnight. Do not call the police." Richard exhaled sharply, his pulse quickening. His first instinct was to dismiss it, a cruel joke, some kind of sick joke. His daughter was not the type to get involved with people she shouldn't. Except, something gnawed at him. The location, the radio silence. He called Emily's school, trying to keep his voice as calm as he always did when speaking to the receptionist. "Mr. Alvarez, she left at 6:15 p.m., the woman said, her voice laced with concern. "She didn't wait for a car, she walked." Richard frowned. "Walked? Where?" "We assume she's meeting you." He ended the call, his stomach churning. He glanced back at the text messages on his phone. The storm outside was getting fiercer, the wind pounding against the glass as if urging him to move. With calculated precision, he stood, his mind already on action. He checked the security panel again, replaying the street camera feeds. Still nothing. He crossed the room to Emily's bedroom, usually off limits. The space was uncluttered, a book open on her desk, face down where she'd left it that morning. The bed was unmade, her coat draped over the back of a chair. Little details that, if given another moment, would have made him smile. He scanned the room, looking for anything out of place, and then he saw it. A photograph, half tucked under her lamp. He held his breath as he pulled it out. Emily stood next to a man he didn't recognize, 30-something, thin, angular, with a confident smile. There was something about him that made Richard uneasy, the kind of man who shouldn't be around his daughter. He turned the photograph over. A handwritten note was scrawled on the back. "He knows the truth." Richard stared at the words, the air in the room growing colder. A clap of thunder rumbled in the sky, but he barely heard it. A name curled at the edge of his mind, just out of reach. He turned back to the text. His decision was made. He grabbed his jacket, stuffed his phone in his pocket, and stepped out into the storm. Outside, the city shook around him, horns blaring, Water rushing through the gutters, neon signs flashing through sheets of rain. Richard kept his pace steady, his mind running through every possible scenario. Who had sent the text? What truth did this man know? And most importantly, where was Emily? As he walked, the lights of the penthouse disappeared behind him, swallowed up by the city. The storm was coming, looming over him like a warning, but Richard Alvarez had never been the type to heed warnings. He would go to 13th Street, and he would go alone. The city murmured softly. The rain had eased, every puddle reflecting the flickering neon lights of shuttered stores and seedy bars. Richard Alvarez walked through the dark backstreets of New York, his tailored jacket doing nothing to shield him from the damp chill that seeped into his bones. This was not a place for him, too dirty. His polished shoes clicked on the uneven pavement, an anomaly in the crumbling bricks. He hadn't been to this part of town in years. He checked his watch, 11:53 p.m. The alley was deserted, save for the scurrying of a rat in the shadows. Water dripped from a rusted fire escape. The stench of stale beer still hung in the air. Then a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the faint glow of a flickering streetlight. A woman, slightly hunched, wearing a tattered coat, her hair disheveled. Her eyes, however, were sharp, looking at him with curiosity. "Richard Alvarez?" Her voice was hoarse. He tensed. "Who are you?" The woman smiled, stepping forward slowly. "A friend of your daughter's." The air between them changed, tense. Richard looked at her. He didn't believe Emily would associate with someone like this, a woman who looked like she had been dragged through the worst corners of the city. "She left something for you," the woman continued, pulling something out of her pocket. Richard's hand instinctively moved into his pocket, touching the switchblade he carried for situations like this. The woman noticed, but didn't react. Instead, she pulled out a small black USB drive, holding it between her fingers. "She told me to give you this," she said. "Tell me and you'll know what to do with it." Richard took it. "Who are you?" he repeated. The woman sighed, shifting her weight. "Call me Rosa. That doesn't answer my question." "I don't owe you an answer," she replied. "I owe it to Emily." His stomach clenched at the sound of his daughter's name coming from this stranger's mouth. He looked at the USB drive, then at Rosa's face. There was something unreadable in her expression, something between exhaustion and defiance. "Where is she?" "I don't know," he asked patiently. "Then how did you get it?" "She gave it to me," Rosa said simply. "She said if anything happened, you'd need it." The alley smelled of wet concrete and cigarette smoke, the neon glow of a broken streetlight illuminating cracks in the sidewalk. Richard stood still. The woman before him, tired, sharp-eyed, held a small object. "A USB drive." "She told me to give you this," she said, her voice hoarse. "Tell me, and you'll know what to do with it." Richard stood still at first. His eyes darted back and forth between the USB drive and the woman's face. But there was something about her posture, something both cautious and determined. He reached forward, plucking the drive from her hand, his fingers brushing against the cold plastic. It seemed insignificant in his palm, but the weight of what it could hold took his breath away. He clenched his jaw. "Then how did you get this?" He held the USB between them in an accusation. "She gave it to me." Rosa's answer was simple, but there was weight to her words. An urgency that could not be expressed, the words hidden within them. "She said if anything happened, you would need it." Richard's breathing was slow and deliberate, his mind weighing every possibility, every lie that could be woven into this moment. If anything happened, Emily knew she was walking into danger. And she hadn't come to him. "And you'd need to see it for yourself." His pulse quickened. This was no game. If Emily went to the trouble of leaving something for him, she was in more trouble than he could have imagined. He reached for the USB, his fingers brushing against the cold plastic. Rosa looked at him, her expression wary. "If you find her," Rosa said softly, "tell her not to come back." Richard tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "Why?" Rosa took a step back into the darkness. "Because they're watching." Before he could go any further, she turned, disappearing into the alley. The darkness swallowed her. The penthouse was colder than usual when Richard returned. He locked the door behind him, took off his damp jacket and tossed it over the back of the chair. The city stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, lights stretching endlessly. He didn't take the time to admire the view. He headed straight for the study, his fingers tightening around the USB. His mind raced. Who was Rosa? How did Emily know her? And why did she trust her enough to leave her this message instead of coming to him? Richard sat at his desk, inserted the drive into his laptop. The screen flickered, and for a moment nothing happened. Then a single video file appeared. He held his breath. He reached for the mousepad before clicking play. The screen was filled with grainy footage, the light dim. The camera shook slightly, as if held by unsteady hands. And then, Emily. She was sitting in what looked like a motel room, her dark hair a mess, the shadows bruising the skin under her eyes. She wasn't crying, but there was something worse in her expression. Fear. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to look at the camera. "Dad," she said, her voice soft but steady. "If you're watching this, something's wrong." Richard's chest tightened. His fingers balled into fists on the table. "I don't have time to explain everything," she continued. "But you need to listen to me. Find the man with the eagle tattoo. Don't trust anyone." Her eyes flicked away from the screen as if she'd heard something. His mouth went dry. Elias was a name he'd forgotten too long ago, along with his past mistakes. Their last interaction had been anything but friendly, and Richard had made sure to cut ties before things got out of hand. And now Emily was somehow entangled with him. Richard closed his laptop, pressing his fingers to his temples. His mind raced, trying to bridge the gap, to make sense of something that didn't make sense. The weight of the situation weighed on his shoulders, heavier than anything he'd ever carried. This wasn't about a rebellious teenager making bad choices. Emily was in real danger, and now so was he. He had to find Elias, and he had to do it fast. The past had a way of creeping back, no matter how deeply Richard had buried it. He sat in his dimly lit office, the USB drive still plugged into his laptop, but his attention had shifted. Elias Carter. The name alone was enough to send his mind reeling from memories he'd spent years trying to erase. Richard leaned back in his chair, fingers pressing against his temples. The rain outside had stopped, but the city still groaned with the usual sounds of the night, distant sirens, the hum of traffic. He closed his eyes. 12 years ago, Richard had been younger, sharper, more reckless in other ways. Elias Carter had a way of making things happen, seemingly impossible deals, invisible connections. Richard had bought in, thinking it was just another step up the ladder. Then came the whispers. Fraud, money laundering, blackmail. Richard saw the signs early enough to back out. He remembered the last time he'd spoken to Elias, an argument in a high-rise office overlooking the city. Elias leaned back in his chair, a pleasantly confident smile on his face as Richard slammed a file down on his desk. "You're sloppy," Richard said through gritted teeth. "This is going to blow up, and I'm not doing it with you." Elias just chuckled, taking a sip of his whiskey. "You're not as clean as you think you are, Rich. You're gone now, but that doesn't mean you're free." Richard had left that day and never looked back. Now, he opened his eyes, the weight of that conversation still pressing down on his chest. His fingers moved almost instinctively to the bottom drawer of his desk. It had been years since he'd touched that file, but he knew exactly where it was. The lock clicked. Inside, beneath stacks of legal papers and old contracts, was an old file. He pulled it out, leafing through it with the same dread he felt when reading his own reports. The first few pages were financial reports, pages he had erased from his files. Then came the list. Names. Some were crossed out, some were not. He scanned the list. Bankers, investors, officials, people who had been associated with Elias in one way or another. Some had disappeared from the business world, their reputations ruined. Others had disappeared altogether. Then his eyes landed on the bottom, his own name, Richard Alvarez, not crossed out. He exhaled slowly. Elias had kept this list for a reason, an accident. And now, after all these years, Emily had somehow stumbled into his world. Richard's gut twisted. He needed to find Elias before it was too late. The exclusive nightclub Red Orchid was tucked away in the lower levels of a glass tower, a haven for men like Elias, men who built empires in the shadows. Richard approached the entrance. A man in a black suit, broad-shouldered and as big as a rock, stood by the door. The guard's eyes swept over Richard. "Do you have an invitation?" the guard asked, his voice hoarse. Richard didn't blink. "I'm here to see Elias Carter." The man's expression didn't change, but there was a slight shift in his posture. The doorman looked at him for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Put your hands where I can see them." The door opened and Richard stepped inside. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and perfume, and low music played. It was a tapestry of decadence. Luxurious leather booths, dim yellow lighting, and the murmur of conversation. Richard moved silently through the space, scanning the faces, listening to the insinuations of business transactions disguised as casual conversation. He hadn't been to a place like this in years. Richard saw him. Elias Carter sat in a VIP booth near the back, a glass of dark amber wine in one hand. He was smiling, his teeth glinting in the dim light, surrounded by a group of young men and women who listened intently to his every word. Richard felt something catch in his throat. The man hadn't changed. Still, Richard did not hesitate. He stepped forward, cutting through the crowd, his heart beating steadily. Elias had not seen him yet, and when he did, Richard would be sure that he understood one thing this time: he would not leave. The space between them was filled with noise, laughter, the clinking of glasses, but to Richard, everything around him was silent. All he could see was Elias, sitting lazily in his chair, his fingers gripping his whiskey glass as if he had no care in the world. Richard took slow, cautious steps forward, feeling the weight of each step. Elias still hadn't noticed him, but when Richard reached the edge of the counter, Elias finally looked up. A smirk played at the corner of his lips. "Okay," he said slowly, tilting his glass. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Richard didn't sit down. He didn't blink. He kept his voice even. "Where's my daughter?" Elias sighed, as if the question bored him. "Get to the point. No pleasantries?" He gestured to the space beside him. "Come on, Rich, have a drink. It's been years." Richard's patience was wearing thin. He leaned forward, both palms flat on the polished wood of the table. "Where is Emily?" Elias studied him, amusement flickering behind his eyes. Then, without taking his eyes off her, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black device. He pressed a button, and then Richard heard her voice. "He never cared about me. All he loved was money." The words cut into his heart, making his breath quicken. Emily's voice, his daughter's voice, was clear, not shaky, not afraid. Richard swallowed, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "Liar." Elias merely raised an eyebrow. "Really?" He let the recording play for a moment longer. "He doesn't see me. He never sees me. He only sees himself." Richard's jaw clenched. "She's in danger. You're twisting her words." Elias exhaled, shaking his head. "You always do that, Rich. You construct a reality that suits you and pretend it's true. But the thing is," he leaned forward, his voice low, his eyes shining, "she came to me." Richard's breath caught. "She wanted revenge." Elias continued, his voice almost soft, as if he were comforting an old friend. "You're looking for someone to blame, but it's not me. It's never me." Richard's fingers twitched. "You're lying," Elias said. "Am I lying?" The noise of the club surged around them again, but Richard's world had shrunk to this moment, to these words, to the tangled mess of confusion and anger that was clawing at him. This was impossible. Emily was smart. She wouldn't choose this. But then, she'd said those words. He'd never cared about me. Was he really that blind? Had his absence, his obsession with work, driven her this far? Before he could find the words to protest, a new voice cut through the fog. "You don't know the whole story!" Richard whirled around. Rosa. She stood at the edge of the booth, her coat soaked from the rain outside, her eyes dark and piercing. But there was something different now, something heavier in the way she looked at him. "You're wasting your time trying to get the truth out of him," she said, "because you don't even know what truth you're looking for." Richard frowned. "What the hell are you talking about?" Rosa's gaze didn't waver. Her lips parted, and then she spoke the words that would turn everything upside down. "Emily's mother is still alive." The words were like gunshots. Richard's mind instantly rejected it. His breath came in short, sharp gasps as he stared at Rosa, his body frozen in place. The club around them was filled with noise. Elias's amused grin, the murmur of conversation, the heavy bass rumbling through the floor. Maria was dead. She'd been dead for years. He'd buried her, mourned her. But Rosa stood before him, calm, waiting, her eyes dark. He found his voice, but it was hoarse, unfamiliar. "It can't be." Rosa's expression didn't change. "That's right." The storm inside him was rising fast, and he took a step forward. "You expect me to believe that Maria faked her death?" His voice was low. "That she abandoned her family, abandoned Emily. For what? A fucking magic trick?" Rosa looked him straight in the eye, unflinching. "I hope you'll listen." Richard laughed, but it was a laugh. "I don't have time for this." He turned on his heel, his mind already drifting back to Elias, Emily, and the fact that his daughter had turned to a man he once called a business partner. But Rosa's next words chilled him. "I'm Maria." The club might as well have been silent. His breath caught in his throat, his body stiff. He turned slowly, hesitantly, to look at her. "No." His voice was hoarse. "Maria is dead." She took a step forward, her presence pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't shake. "I have to die," she said. "It's the only way out." His chest tightened. "Out of what?" Her eyes flashed with something like pain. "You." The words were more powerful than any physical blow. Part of him wanted to laugh at her, call her crazy, walk away from this twisted farce. But another part, hidden quietly beneath the armor of years, whispered that she wasn't lying. He shook his head. "You expect me to believe you faked your death and never tried to see Emily?" Rosa, Maria, was startled. "You never stopped looking at her?" Richard felt his mind racing, searching for logic, reason, anything that could make this make sense. "You're lying." She sighed, reaching into her coat. "I knew you would say that." A stack of yellowed envelopes appeared in her hands. Letters. Old, frayed, the ink slightly smudged. She held them out to him. He didn't take them. Instead, he stared. "She wrote me letters," Maria said softly, "years ago, but she never sent them. She hid them in her room under a loose floorboard. When I found her, she gave them to me." His fingers twitched, but he didn't reach for them. Instead, he glanced at her. "Are you telling me Emily knew?" Maria nodded. "Not at first, but eventually." A cold, creepy fear spread through him. "That's why she ran to Elias." Maria hesitated. "Part of it." He let out a sharp breath, frustration rising. "Then tell me, Maria. Tell me the whole story." A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, she spoke. "She found out about the cover-up." The words cut through him. His mouth was dry. "What?" Maria didn't blink. "Emily found out about what you and Elias did all those years ago." Richard's body stiffened. 12 years ago. It had been a deal like any other, or so he had convinced himself. Numbers on a screen, signatures on a contract. Another lucrative deal that would keep his empire intact. Elias had come to him with an opportunity that involved transferring assets, burying some financial statements, making some numbers disappear. Richard had turned a blind eye. By the time the truth came out, it was too late. People had lost everything. Some had lost their homes. Others, he clenched his jaw. He never asked what happened to the people who disappeared. But the deal had been cleaned up, erased from the records. He was gone, untouched, untouchable. Or so he thought. For now. Maria's voice pulled him back. Emily found the records, bank statements, offshore accounts. She pieced them together. His throat tightened. "That's impossible." Maria looked at him wearily. "Your daughter is smarter than you think." Richard's mind was racing. Emily had dug into his past. She had searched for answers he had buried years ago, and in doing so, she had brought herself into Elias's world. He raised his hand to his face, his pulse pounding. "So what, Breaker, the way only someone who loved you could?" He clenched his fists. "Why didn't you tell me?" Maria clenched her jaw. "And what would you do? Lock her up? control her until she saw only what you wanted her to see. He opened his mouth to argue, but found himself speechless. Because she was right. Maria took a slow step forward. You didn't just lose her, Richard. You pushed her away, and now she's with Elias. His stomach clenched. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do. He had always been in control, always known how to fix things, but this was beyond him. There was a long silence between them. Then Maria spoke, her voice softer. If you want her back, you need to face the truth. Richard swallowed, the weight of it all pressing down on him. The truth was simple. Emily had turned her back on him, not because of Elias, because of him. The guilt was suffocating. For the first time, Richard Alvarez doubted himself, and for the first time he thought, maybe I deserved this. The air inside the school felt heavy. Richard walked down the hall, his footsteps echoing. He hadn't been to a school since he was a kid, and certainly not Emily's. That had always been Maria's role, before she disappeared. Now he was here because he had no choice. The office door opened, and a girl sat inside, fiddling with the sleeves of her sweater. Emily's best friend. Her name was Lena Carter. The last name made him uneasy. Carter, like Elias. A relative? He would worry about that later. Right now, she was his only lead. She glanced up as he entered, eyes wary. You're Emily's father. Richard nodded and pulled out a chair across from her. I need to know what happened to my daughter. Lena's eyes flashed, her fingers tightening in her lap. You wouldn't understand. Richard took a deep breath. Lena hesitated, then lowered her voice. She started hanging out with them months ago. At first I thought it was just curiosity, but then she got intense, like she was looking for something. I told her to stay away, but she wouldn't listen. Richard's stomach clenched. Who are they? Lena said. They're not just some stupid club. They're different. They get into your head. They make you believe things that aren't true, and once you're in, you can't get out. Richard leaned forward. Did she ever mention Elias Carter? Lena flinched. Just a little, but it was enough. She told you not to trust anyone, right? Lena whispered. Richard's pulse pounded. Emily's words from the video echoed in his head. Find the man with the eagle tattoo. Don't trust anyone. He pressed his hand against the table. Where would she go if she got into trouble? Lena bit her lip, then hesitated before answering. There's a place, an apartment in Midtown. She used to sneak out and go there. Richard took in the information, then stood. Thanks. She grabbed his wrist as he turned away. If you find her, tell her she's not alone. Richard didn't answer. He wasn't sure Emily believed that anymore. The argument continued in front of the apartment. Back in the car, Rosa sat in the passenger seat, her arms crossed. Rain pelted the windshield, the city lights blurred into a distorted mess. The tension between them had been building since they'd left school. You pushed her into this, Rosa said, her voice strained. Richard gritted his teeth. And you didn't? I tried to keep her safe. He let out a sharp laugh. By lying to her? Rosa clenched her hands into fists. At least I was there. You were too busy hiding behind your empire to notice what was happening right next to you. Richard clenched his jaw. She found out about the cover-up because of you. Rosa turned to him, her eyes shining. She wanted answers because you never told her. You think she wanted revenge? No, Richard. She wanted the truth. And you, she pointed at him, were too much of a coward to tell her. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. The silence stretched between them, thick and stifling. Finally, Rosa let out a breath. Just find that damn apartment. The apartment was a secret Emily had kept close to her heart. Richard stood outside the building, staring at the dimly lit windows, a place she had lived, without his knowledge. He barged in through the side entrance, the hallway dark and narrow. The air smelled old, abandoned. He went to the door Lena had described and tried the handle. It was locked. He used a switchblade to open the door. The door creaked as it swung inward. Inside, the room was small, minimal furniture, a mattress on the floor, scattered books and a desk covered with papers. Richard's pulse quickened. He stepped closer, skimming through the notes. Bank statements, name, relationships. A photograph lay on the desk. It was him. Beside it, a list of people associated with Elias Carter. Some names had been crossed out, just as they had been in his old files. A chill ran down his spine. Emily hadn't just run away. She'd searched for the truth in places no 16-year-old girl should have gone. Richard flipped through the documents, trying to piece them together. She'd found more than he'd thought. And if Elias got to her before she knew the whole truth? A noise. Richard's head snapped up. A shift in the darkness. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He wasn't alone. The papers crumpled in his hands as he slowly turned around. The room had only one entrance and he was standing in front of it, which meant a breath. Right behind him. He turned, his hand raised, but it was too late. A figure darted out of the darkness. Darkness closed in. Richard barely had time to react before something slammed into his ribs, knocking him backward. His shoulder hit the desk, papers scattering like embers in the dimly lit apartment. A punch followed, fast, brutal, slamming into his jaw with enough force to blind him. He tasted blood. The intruder was masked, dressed in black, moving professionally. Richard twisted, rolling off the desk as another blow missed him by inches. He hit the floor hard, but used the force to drive an elbow into the masked man's stomach. A snarl, a stumble. Richard lunged, lunging forward, struggling for control. The apartment was in chaos. They smashed into furniture, smashed a lamp. Richard managed to pin his attacker for a moment, his fingers closing around the edge of the mask. A quick tug, and the cloth slipped. A flash of dark hair, sharp, narrowed eyes. But before Richard could see anything else, the man slammed his knee into his stomach, pinning him. He stumbled, coughing, and in that split second the attacker was free. Richard heard a rustle of movement, a creak of the floor. The masked man was running. "Fuck!" Richard hissed, struggling to his feet. His ribs ached, but he ran after the intruder, dashing out into the hallway just in time to see the figure disappear down the fire escape. His feet pounded against the metal steps. Richard followed. They descended floor by floor, the old building groaning with each step. Richard was faster, closing the gap. He reached for the man's shoulder. A sharp elbow that shot back, catching Richard in the temple. His vision blurred and he barely managed to grab the railing before he fell. By the time he regained his balance, the attacker was at the bottom of the stairs. The stairwell door slammed open and the night swallowed him up. Richard stumbled out onto the street, scanning the rain-slicked sidewalk. Gone. But then he saw it. A small piece of paper fluttered near the curb, half soaked with rain. Richard bent down, his fingers closing around it. He turned it over, breathing heavily. Richard sat on the edge of the bed, the coordinates spread out on the table. Across from him, Rosa leaned against the wall, her arms crossed. "This could be a trap," she said grimly. Richard didn't look up. "It's all we have," she sighed, shaking her head. "You don't even know who it is. It could have been Elias who sent you on a mad chase. It could have been someone else entirely." Richard tapped the paper. "Then why not kill me there?" Rosa's eyes darkened. She had no answer. Richard turned back to the numbers. His mind worked quickly, mapping the location against the city. The coordinates weren't in the center of town. They were farther out, near the industrial area. A dead zone of abandoned factories and empty lots. His stomach clenched. "Under the lights," he muttered. Rosa frowned. "What?" Emily's friend mentioned it. He caught Rosa's eye. "It's not just a cult, they're recruiting." Her lips pressed together. "So she's there?" Richard nodded. "And I'm going to get her out." The warehouse loomed ahead, a hollow, skeletal old structure, standing tall in the darkness like the last remnant of something long abandoned. The windows were shattered, the paint peeling, but there was movement inside. The lights were dim, flickering. Richard and Rosa crouched behind a rusted car, surveying the scene. A guard stood by the entrance, smoking a cigarette, his posture relaxed. He didn't expect trouble. Rosa whispered, "Let's go in quietly." Richard didn't object. His body was tense, every muscle ready for what was to come. He didn't let himself think. He didn't let himself feel. He just moved. They slipped around the side, crouching low, pressed against the damp walls. The air smelled of oil and decay. The sound of muffled voices echoed through the vast space ahead. Richard crept forward, and then he heard it. Emily's voice. He froze. A single word drifting from the open front door. "I know the truth." His pulse pounded. He glanced at Rosa, then walked toward the door, breathless, eyes sharp. The moment stretched, and then Richard stepped inside, and everything changed. The warehouse was filled with whispers. Richard stood in the shadows, his breathing slow and controlled. The large, airy space was filled with makeshift seating, rays of mismatched chairs, crates turned into benches. Young men and women sat in clusters, their faces illuminated by the dim, flickering lights above. Some listened intently, others nodded in agreement. Ahead, perched on a raised platform, was Emily. His heart clenched. She wasn't tied down. She wasn't trapped. Richard's breath caught as he took in the scene before him. Emily stood on stage, illuminated by the flickering lights of the warehouse, her dark hair pulled back, her posture unwavering. She carried herself with a confidence that was both foreign and unsettling, her presence commanding the attention of the entire room. The air reeked of sweat, rust, and old motor oil, a heavy tension looming. Richard moved forward, each step slow, as if he were walking through quicksand. He couldn't act rashly. His pulse pounded in his ears, but he forced himself to listen to the words that spilled from Emily's lips. Her voice cut through the silence, strong and unwavering. The crowd gathered, young faces. Richard's stomach clenched. This wasn't his daughter, not the Emily he'd raised, not the girl he'd tried to protect. His fingers clenched into fists at his sides. He knew she was here, but seeing her like this, hearing her like this, it was worse than he'd thought. Emily's eyes scanned the crowd, then settled on him, a flash of recognition. Then it was gone. She straightened, her face stiff, her voice betraying nothing. "You shouldn't have come here." The words were a blow, sharp and precise, aimed at the hollow in his chest. Richard swallowed. "Emily?" Her voice didn't waver, but there was something else beneath the surface, something fragile, something she was trying to bury beneath. He knew her too well. "I came for you," he said, his voice low and even, "to take you home." She stiffened. "This is my home." Richard shook his head. "No, not at all." Some watched curiously, others with hostility. Richard ignored them. He focused on her. "Emily, you don't have to do that," he continued, his arms hanging limply at his sides, the tension in his body shifting. He stepped forward. "Whatever they told you, whatever you think you know, I know the truth." Her voice was sharp, cutting through the space between them like a knife. He paused. It was a trap. She wanted him to ask, to expose the very thing that had shattered everything. Elias's voice came out of the darkness before he could answer. "Oh, isn't this touching?" The room shifted. The crowd parted, forming a path as Elias emerged from the darkness, his movements graceful. "Richard Alvarez," Elias said slowly, his lips curling into a smirk. "You're a busy man." Richard forced himself to stand still, to keep his breathing steady. Elias's eyes flicked to Emily, then back to Richard. "I must say, I'm impressed. You've come this far." Richard ignored the coaxing. "Let her go." Elias chuckled. "Let her go?" He gestured around the room. "She's not a prisoner, Richard. She's exactly where she chose to be." Richard clenched his jaw. "Emily, she made her choice," Elias interrupted. "I can't accept that." Richard clenched his fists. "Not here, not in front of everyone." "I know what you did to her," he said, his voice still calm. "The manipulation, the lies. You put poison in her head." Elias chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, Richard, you really don't understand, do you?" He turned to Emily, his expression softening. "Tell him." Emily hesitated, then she slowly lifted her chin. "He didn't manipulate me," she said. "He told me the truth." Richard felt his world tilt. Emily took a step toward him, her voice quieter now, aimed at him. "I know what Dad did." "I know about the cover-up," she whispered. "I know about the people who suffered because of Dad." His throat was dry. "Emily, I trust you," she said. "I think you're a good person." Richard's hands shook at his sides. "I never wanted to hurt anyone." This was someone else, someone shaped by Elias. Emily's eyes scanned the crowd, and then she saw him. For a brief moment, everything froze. Richard took a step forward, barely breathing. "Emily!" Her lips parted, but she didn't move. Didn't run to him, didn't cry for help. Instead, her gaze fell, and she whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." The words were more powerful than any blow. Richard shook his head. "Emily, go home. Whatever he said to you, whatever he did." Her expression hardened. "He told me the truth." Richard's chest tightened. "And what was that truth?" Emily took a breath. "That you covered it up, that you—" She hesitated just for a second, but then she regained her composure. "That you let people suffer so you could protect your empire." Her pulse pounded. "You don't understand." "No," she snapped, her voice booming. "I finally understand." Before Richard could reply, a slow clap echoed through the warehouse. Elias. He stepped out of the shadows, his presence commanding, his smirk unwavering. He still had the easy arrogance Richard remembered, but there was something more to it now. Power. All right, Richard," Elias said slowly, walking down the platform steps. "You did it, although I must say I expected you to come sooner." Richard barely glanced at him. He was still focused on Emily. His daughter, his little girl. She didn't move toward him. She didn't reach for him. She was standing next to Elias. Elias put his arm around her shoulders, casual, possessive. "She came to us willingly," he said. "She's not your prisoner, Richard. She's not your property." Richard clenched his jaw. "She's my daughter." Elias chuckled. "That's funny, because for years I certainly don't remember that." Richard stepped forward, his voice low. "Emily, listen to me. Whatever he promised you, whatever he made you believe—" "He didn't make you believe anything," Emily snapped. "You made your choice." Richard stared at her, his chest heaving. "Then come with me, now." The silence that followed was deafening. Emily didn't move, didn't blink. Elias grinned, squeezing her shoulder. "See, Richard? You're too late." Richard's vision blurred. He wanted to push Elias away, to drag Emily away, but he knew he couldn't fight his way out of here. And then he saw movement from the edge of the room. Security. The doors were no longer unguarded. Figures emerged from the shadows, silently but purposefully. Approaching. Richard's stomach dropped. They had walked into a trap. Then, from behind him, Rosa's voice cut through the thick tension. "We need to run, now." Chaos erupted. As soon as Rosa's voice rang out, Richard ran. His instincts urged him to grab Emily and run, but she froze, eyes wide as she stared between him and Elias. "Emily, now!" he shouted, lunging toward her. But before he could reach her, Elias was too fast. He grabbed Emily's wrist, jerking her back as security closed in. The shadows around them shifted, men emerging from the shadows, their faces cold, their intentions clear. Richard paused, clenching his fists. Rosa was beside him, panting, her eyes darting back and forth between the guards and Elias. "You're not allowed to leave here with her," Elias said, tightening his grip on Emily's arm. Emily flinched, but didn't resist. Her face was unreadable. Rage boiled in Richard's chest. "Let her go," Elias sneered. "Or what? You think you can fight your way out of this?" Richard's mind raced. He could take out one, maybe two, in a head-on fight. But there were too many, and Emily was still standing next to Elias instead of running toward him. Then Elias spoke again. "Or maybe we don't have to fight," he mused, tilting his head. "Maybe you should just listen." Richard's muscles flexed. "I don't make deals with scum." Elias chuckled. "You did, years ago, and you'll do it again." He gestured to one of his men, who pulled a shiny black file from inside his jacket. Elias took it casually, flipping it open before looking at Richard. "Sign it," Elias said, tossing the file onto a nearby table. "And she's gone." Richard barely needed to glance at the document to know what it was. His business, his empire, everything he'd built. Elias raised his hand, cutting her off. "You sign it, Richard, and I'll wipe it all out. You and Emily will be gone. No one will follow, no one will come after you. But if you don't—" He squeezed Emily tighter. Richard's fingers twitched. His mind screamed. He couldn't trust Elias, but could he afford to gamble with Emily's life? He forced himself to meet Emily's eyes. "Is this what you want?" For a long, agonizing moment, she said nothing. Then a blink. A hesitation, The tiniest change in her eyes, something was wrong. And then she spoke, her voice a little flat. "You should sign it." The world tilted. There was something in her voice, soft too much. He glanced at her. A message burning there just below the surface. A message she couldn't quite put into words. Then he saw it, the small, almost imperceptible movement of her fingers tapping against her thigh. 1, 2, 3. A code. Wait. Richard exhaled slowly, his hands relaxed. His heartbeat slowed, and then he reached for the pen. Elias grinned. Smart man. Richard picked up the pen, rolled it between his fingers, paused. Emily stood still, her face expressionless. Then, a beep, soft, almost drowned out by the noise around her, but Richard heard it. Elias stiffened, his smile faltered. Then Emily spoke again, calm, steady, but still firm in her words. "Do you understand?" The atmosphere in the room changed. Elias's eyes darkened. "What the hell did you just say?" Emily reached into her pocket and pulled out a small black recording device, still flashing red. A heartbeat, then another. Then she pressed play. Elias's voice rang through the air, clear as day. "You sign, Richard, and I'll erase everything. You and Emily are gone. No one follows. No one's after you." A recording. A confession. Proof. The room exploded. Elias lunged at Emily, growling. Richard moved faster. His fist slammed into Elias's jaw, sending the man reeling. Security rushed forward, but Rosa was already acting, grabbing the nearest chair and slamming into one of the guards. Emily ducked as another lunged at her, rolling under the table and running. Richard fought like a man possessed. He grabbed a guard by the collar, slamming him into a metal post. Another swung at him, but Rosa was there first, knife flashing in her hand as she cut a shallow cut down the guard's arm, sending him staggering back with a curse. Emily ran for the exit. "We have to go now!" More guards rushed in. Too many. Rosa grabbed Richard's wrist. "We're outnumbered." He knew it. They all knew it. Then Elias, staggering. The rumble behind them, but they didn't stop. Down the alley, past rusted cars, through a maze of industrial ruins, a black truck screeched to a stop in front of them. The doors slid open. Richard almost charged until he saw Lena. "Get in, now!" she yelled. They rushed in. As soon as they were inside, the doors slammed shut. Tires screeched. The city blurred as the truck drove away. Unable to breathe, Richard turned to Emily, who was watching him. "No more hiding. No more running. I never trusted him," she whispered. "I never stopped fighting." Richard's throat tightened. He had his daughter back, but this wasn't over. Not yet. The next day, morning light crept across the city skyline, painting the glass towers in soft lavenders and golds. The world had changed overnight. Elias Carter was handcuffed. The news was everywhere. The leaked recordings had gone viral, spreading through the media like wildfire. The charges against him were insurmountable: extortion, conspiracy, money laundering, and human trafficking. He had tried to run, but there was nowhere left to hide. By the time federal agents stormed his safe house, Elias knew it was over. Richard stood in front of the television in his penthouse, watching footage of Elias being led into a police car. Even through the screen, he could see the rage boiling beneath Elias's placid expression. He would never forget this. He would never forgive it. But it didn't matter. It was over. Richard exhaled slowly, his body aching from the events of the past few days. The bruises, the cuts, nothing compared to the exhaustion that seeped into his bones. Behind him, Emily sat at the kitchen table, her hands clutching her coffee cup. She was silent, watching the same broadcast. There was something distant in her eyes, something Richard knew would take time to heal. "You did it," he said, his voice soft. Emily's lips twitched, but it wasn't a smile. "We did it." He studied her. She was different now. No longer the girl he'd tried to save. No longer the child who needed saving. She'd saved herself. And in doing so, she'd saved him too. Redemption wasn't easy. Richard knew what he had to do. That afternoon, he walked into a conference room packed with reporters, cameras flashing as he took the podium. The silence in the room was deafening. He gripped the edge of the podium. This was the hardest thing he had ever done. "I built an empire on secrecy," he said, his voice even. And for years I told myself that what I did was right, that the ends would always justify the means. He swallowed. I was wrong. The room was still. He continued, there are people who suffered because of the choices I made, families who lost everything, and I can't undo what I did. But I can take responsibility for it. A murmur ran through the crowd. He had never admitted guilt before, not publicly, not in private, until now. Richard took a breath. Effective immediately, I will resign as CEO of Alvarez Holdings. The company will be restructured under new leadership, and I will cooperate fully with the authorities regarding my past dealings. A barrage of questions erupted from the press, but Richard didn't hear it. He had said what needed to be said. For the first time in his life, he felt free. Emily didn't say much after his confession. That night, she stood by the window of their penthouse, staring out at the city. You don't have to do this, she muttered. Richard walked over to her. Yes, I will. She didn't look at him, but he saw the tension in her posture. It won't erase the past. No, he admitted. But maybe it's enough to start over. Emily exhaled slowly. After a moment of silence, she said, I don't know how to forgive you. Richard's chest tightened, but he nodded. It's okay. Finally, she turned to him, looking him straight in the eyes. But I want to try. Not all, but it was enough. Rosa was gone. The next morning, Richard woke to find her room empty. No note, no message, no sign of where she had gone. But that night, a letter arrived. An envelope with his name scrawled across the front in familiar handwriting. His fingers trembled as he opened it. Richard, you did what you had to do. Take care of her. Maybe someday we'll meet again. Ah. He let out a sharp breath, staring at the words until they blurred. Then he folded the letter and put it away. He wouldn't chase after her. Maybe she was right. Maybe someday they would meet again. But right now he had something more important to focus on. The sky was beginning to lighten as Richard and Emily stood by the window again, watching the sunrise. The city below stretched out endlessly, filled with possibilities that neither of them could have predicted. Emily leaned against the glass, arms crossed. What now? Richard smiled weakly. Now we'll find out. She turned to him, thinking about his words. Then, for the first time in a long time, she smiled back. The future was uncertain, but they had the power to rebuild. The sun was high in the sky when Richard and Emily left the penthouse. The city stretched out before them, bustling and alive, as if the past few weeks hadn't shaken their world to its core, but for them, everything had changed. The road to salvation was never clean. It was rough, uneven, and cruel. Richard had spent his life clinging to the top, only to find that the family inside him had been rotten for years. He had built an empire with Elias Carter, laced with secrets and lies, only to see it crumble in his hands. And now he had chosen to walk away. But walking away didn't mean running away from the consequences. Richard sat in a dimly lit office at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, his hands folded on the desk as the agent across from him flipped through a thick file. The weight of his past weighed on his shoulders, heavier than ever. Mr. Alvarez, the agent said, finally looking up. This is a long confession. Richard nodded. I know. The agent leaned back in his chair. You're going to face criminal charges. Your assets will be audited, your accounts frozen. The media won't let this go, and neither will the people you hurt. Richard looked him straight in the eye. I deserve it. The agent nodded. Yes. There was no malice in the words, just cold, hard truth. Richard sat in a dimly lit office at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, his hands folded on the desk as the agent across from him flipped through a thick file. The weight of his past weighed on his shoulders, heavier than ever. Mr. Alvarez, the agent said, finally looking up. This is a long confession. Richard nodded. I know. You know that cooperating with us does not guarantee immunity. I don't want immunity, Richard said firmly. I want to do this right. The agent looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to gauge whether he was telling the truth. Do you understand what you're admitting? Richard exhaled. I do. The agent leaned back in his chair. You're going to face criminal charges. Your assets will be audited, your accounts frozen. The media won't let this go, and neither will the people you hurt. Richard looked him straight in the eye. I deserve it. The agent nodded. Yes. There was no malice in the words, just cold, hard truth. As Richard signed the first of many legal statements, he felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to game the system to create a perspective. He was facing it head on, and that in itself was a form of freedom. Emily's choice. Emily watched from the doorway as her father walked out of the FBI building. He looked different, softer somehow. She had spent so much time resenting him, blaming him, hating him for who he was. But now, for the first time, she saw him trying, really trying, and it was more than she had ever thought possible. As he drew near, she spoke softly. So, what now? Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. Emily hesitated. Are you going to jail? Maybe. He didn't say it sweetly. I'll be investigated, maybe prosecuted, depending on what they find. She swallowed. And if you leave, he looked at her, his eyes softer than she had ever seen them. Then I hope you're still here when I get out. She considered that for a moment. Then she nodded. I think I will. Not forgiveness. A letter, a goodbye. The letter sat on Richard's desk for days before he found the strength to read it again. Rosa was gone. It wasn't her passing that surprised him. It was her. A ghost, a survivor, a woman who had long since learned to live in the space between the shadows. But even so, as he opened the letter and read the words again, I did what I had to do, take care of her. Maybe someday we'll meet again. He felt the familiar pang of regret rising in his chest. She had never been steadfast, and perhaps, in another life, he might have fought harder to keep her here, but in this one he knew better. She had given him a second chance with Emily, and that was enough. Moving forward. The days passed. The world moved on, as it always did. Elias Carter's trial was set, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. His empire had collapsed overnight, his wealth seized, his influence reduced to nothing. He had tried to negotiate, to reach a deal, but no one would listen. He was done. Richard had spent years believing he was invincible, that he could shape the world to suit his needs. Now, he was learning to live with the truth. He no longer had a business empire, no more late-night meetings, no more high-stakes negotiations, and he didn't miss it. Instead, he spent his mornings sipping coffee in silence, his afternoons rebuilding the small pieces of his life. Emily had enrolled in college, a new beginning, and, for the first time in years, they learned to be a family. The last dawn, Richard and Emily stood on the balcony, the endless sky stretching out before them, bathed in the colors of dawn. I don't know what's going to happen next, Richard admitted. Emily smiled weakly. It's okay.